Imagine in the stillness of dawn, the world's lifeblood halts. Not a missile fired, not a bomb bopped, but a silence in the sea. The Strait of Hormuz, once the pulsing vein of global energy, is closed. One narrow corridor, no wider than 21 miles at its tightest, holds the breath of nations. And Iran, with deliberate precision, has just pressed the world's most sensitive pressure point. In that instant, headlines scream, traders panic, nations brace. What follows is not just a regional dispute, but a tremor that rattles the entire global order. From oil giants in Texas to factories in Japan, from Wall Street to village markets in Africa, the world feels the chokehold, a move strategic in nature but volcanic in consequence. Welcome to the edge of global paralysis. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway nestled between Iran and Oman, has long been recognized not merely as a passage of water, but as a fulcrum of global energy dynamics. At its narrowest, it spans just 21 miles, yet this slender corridor carries nearly 20% of the world's petroleum supply, approximately 17 million barrels of oil every single day. When Iran decisively sealed this route, the world wasn't just watching a naval maneuver, it was witnessing the clamping shut of an economic artery. To understand the gravity of this act, one must appreciate the strait's role. It connects the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea, acting as the primary channel through which Gulf oil exporters, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iraq and Qatar, transport crude to global markets. Most of this oil is destined for power-hungry nations in Asia, but its impact is global. The moment the strait was blocked, the flow of energy was disrupted, like a sudden constriction in the circulatory system of the world economy. Iran's ability to exert control over this narrow strip of water has always been a geopolitical lever, a trump card held close to its chest. The decision to shut it, however, transforms that leverage into action. A move many analysts long feared but never expected to see fully realized. The closure instantly upends maritime logistics. Oil tankers reroute, deliveries are delayed, insurance rates for shipping skyrocket, and confidence in free trade through the Gulf region is deeply shaken. The physicality of the strait also plays into Iran's hands. Its coastline hugs the northern edge of the waterway, giving it dominant geographical control. With an array of missile batteries, naval mines, submarines and fast attack boats, Iran can enforce its blockade with both direct and asymmetric tactics. Satellite images reveal Iranian vessels deploying sea mines, while missile launchers are repositioned along coastal ridges. All of this is designed not necessarily for total military dominance, but for deterrence. The message is clear: any attempt to reopen the strait by force will come at a steep cost. But Iran's action is not born in a vacuum. It is the product of long-building tensions, sanctions, political isolation, regional proxy conflicts, and perceived existential threats. The sealing of the strait is not just a military gesture, it is a symbolic act of defiance. It tells the world that Iran will no longer be sidelined or dictated to. It's a geopolitical roar, amplified by the vulnerability of global energy dependency. In response, naval forces from multiple countries begin to mobilize. U.S. aircraft carriers, British destroyers, and French frigates enter the Gulf, not just to reopen the passage, but to send a message of collective resolve. Yet every movement is calculated. No one wants an all-out war in one of the most volatile regions on Earth. But every passing day that the strait remains shut, the tension mounts, and the risk of miscalculation grows. This single action, closing a waterway, has forced the world to re-evaluate energy security, regional stability, and the razor-thin balance of power that holds modern civilization together. For decades, the Strait of Hormuz has been seen as a strategic vulnerability. Now, with its closure, that theory has become reality. The impact is immediate, and the repercussions are only beginning to unfold. The moment Iran shut the Strait of Hormuz, the global economy was jolted into chaos. Markets reacted with near-instant shock. Within hours, crude oil prices surged by more than 20%, triggering a cascade of volatility across financial exchanges worldwide. Investors scrambled to make sense of the sudden blockage of a maritime artery responsible for nearly a fifth of global oil supply. The panic wasn't confined to energy markets. It bled into currency exchanges, commodities, shipping, logistics, and even the tech sector, which depends on both fuel and global transport networks. Oil, being the lifeblood of modern economies, has a direct and often disproportionate impact on everything from inflation rates to consumer confidence. The cost of gasoline at the pump began climbing in countries thousands of miles from the Gulf. In industrialized economies, transportation and logistics companies braced for soaring fuel bills. Airlines began slashing flights and adjusting routes. Manufacturing firms reliant on just-in-time supply chains were thrown into disarray, faced with higher freight costs and delayed shipments. Emerging economies suffered almost immediately. Countries without significant energy reserves, particularly in Asia and parts of Africa, were forced to dip into emergency fuel supplies or face rolling blackouts. Their currencies weakened against the dollar as central banks rushed to stabilize volatile financial systems. In places like India and Indonesia, food prices began to climb, not because of shortages in crops, but because of the rising cost of transporting those crops from rural areas to urban markets. Global trade, already fragile from past disruptions and lingering post-pandemic recovery, buckled further under the pressure. The major shipping companies issued warnings that delivery timelines would stretch. Insurance premiums for cargo vessels transiting near the Gulf spiked. The rerouting of oil and gas shipments via longer, more expensive paths only exacerbated the price shock, adding days or even weeks to delivery schedules. Stock markets in New York, London, Tokyo, and Shanghai saw sharp dips. The energy sector boomed for a brief moment, but other sectors, technology, manufacturing, and consumer goods, saw investors flee in search of safer assets like gold and U.S. Treasury bonds. Uncertainty reigned, and with it came fear. Fear of a prolonged crisis, of military escalation, and of a new economic downturn. Major corporations began issuing profit warnings, not because of losses already incurred, but because of expected turbulence in the weeks and months to come. Automakers, especially those reliant on Gulf-based petrochemical products, foresaw parts shortages. Retail giants warned of rising shipping costs and delayed inventories, setting the stage for inflationary pressures that could persist far beyond the immediate crisis. Governments convened emergency meetings. Economic advisors were called into war rooms to simulate worst-case scenarios. Fuel subsidies were reintroduced in some nations to prevent social unrest. Others considered rationing measures. The International Monetary Fund issued statements, cautioning against panic but acknowledging that a prolonged closure of the strait could push the global economy toward recession. Meanwhile, the energy futures market became a battlefield of speculation. Traders hedged against the unknown. Would the blockade last a week, a month, longer? Would military intervention drive prices higher or restore confidence? The sheer uncertainty surrounding Iran's intentions and the international response only served to deepen economic instability. The interconnectedness of today's world means that a disruption in one place, especially one so vital as the Strait of Hormuz, does not remain a localized incident. It spreads through shipping lanes, financial networks, supply chains, and consumer behavior, What began as a political act became almost instantly a global economic event, and in boardrooms, marketplaces, and households across the world, the cost of that disruption was starting to be felt not just in dollars and cents, but in the tightening grip of insecurity. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz triggered not just economic tremors, but an immediate and intense military escalation. Within hours of the announcement, radar images and intelligence reports confirmed an unusual buildup of military activity across the Gulf region. Naval fleets began repositioning, air bases went on high alert, and the geopolitical chessboard, long strained, suddenly shifted into kinetic readiness. The United States, maintaining a long-standing military presence in the region through its Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain, responded first. Aircraft carriers, accompanied by destroyers and guided missile cruisers, were ordered toward the strait. Surveillance drones soared above the Gulf waters, feeding real-time imagery back to command centers. Submarines known to patrol the deeper waters surrounding the strait began to maneuver silently into strategic positions. The message was clear: the world would not tolerate a prolonged disruption of a vital artery without visible consequences. Iran, in turn, ramped up its own military posture. Fast attack boats and missile-equipped patrol vessels appeared along its southern coast. Coastal batteries armed with anti-ship missiles were activated and repositioned. Videos released by Iranian state media showed armed forces conducting live fire drills and simulating confrontations with foreign vessels. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the elite and ideologically driven branch of Iran's military, took center stage in broadcasting deterrence through strength. Gulf nations such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE, already wary of Iran's regional ambitions, increased their own military readiness. Fighter jets were placed on standby, air defense systems were tested, joint drills with Western allies were accelerated. Bahrain, Qatar and Kuwait, each hosting US or coalition forces, bolstered maritime security zones and moved non-essential personnel from vulnerable coastal facilities. As tensions escalated, the international community held its breath. Naval posturing meant to deter, not provoke, risked unintended confrontations. A radar lock-on, a misinterpreted maneuver, or an accidental collision could ignite a firestorm. Military strategists likened the situation to dry kindling. The tools for a major conflict were already in place, and all it would take was a spark. In the Mediterranean and Arabian seas, Allied ships from NATO countries began converging. The United Kingdom deployed its Royal Navy destroyers, equipped with Sea Viper missile systems and electronic warfare suites. France, a key player in Gulf security, dispatched a frigate to join a multinational effort to secure alternate maritime routes and maintain pressure. Meanwhile, Israel, though not directly involved, placed its own forces on high alert, recognizing that any large-scale Gulf conflict could quickly spiral into regional war. Satellite communications intercepted military chatter that hinted at war games, turning into real-world engagement strategies. U.S. generals in CENTCOM activated contingency plans for a possible naval confrontation. Carrier-based aircraft began flying patrols not just for reconnaissance, but for force projection, sending a message that the strait and the oil that flows through it was a line in the sand. Meanwhile, backdoor diplomatic channels attempted to temper the rising temperature. Oman, historically a mediator between Iran and the West, quietly facilitated dialogue. Turkey and Russia offered to broker talks, each with their own regional interests. But the military machines had already begun moving, large and unwieldy once set into motion. The longer the strait remained shut, the more these forces entrenched themselves, prepared not just for defense, but for engagement. The Gulf, under the harsh glare of the sun and satellites, became a theater of brinkmanship. Submarines beneath the waves, drones above the clouds, and warships slicing through contested waters all coexisted in a delicate, deadly balance. The world hoped for de-escalation, but the atmosphere on the ground and at sea was unmistakable. The region had entered a phase of armed readiness where every signal mattered, every movement was calculated, and the margin for error had vanished. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz by Iran did not just provoke military reactions or economic tremors, it cracked open the fault lines of global geopolitical alliances. The world, long held in a fragile balance of power, was suddenly forced to choose sides, reassert loyalties, and in some cases question old partnerships. The incident acted like a stress test for the alliances that have shaped international relations for decades. The United States, as expected, moved swiftly. Its traditional allies in the Gulf Cooperation Council, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain and Kuwait rallied to its position not just because of shared interests in keeping oil flowing, but because of the deep military and economic ties they share with Washington. For these nations, Iran's action was not just a regional provocation, it was a challenge to their sovereignty and economic survival. Yet behind closed doors, even some of these allies expressed concern. How far would the US go? Would escalation turn their territories into targets? The strategic unity in public was tempered by anxiety in private. NATO, though focused on European affairs, was pulled into the spotlight. The alliance faced an urgent question: should it act collectively to protect global maritime routes, or leave this to individual member states? Countries like the United Kingdom and France deployed naval assets in support of the US position. But others, such as Germany and Spain, urged caution, wary of entanglement in another Middle Eastern crisis. The alliance appeared united in rhetoric but divided in action, revealing cracks in the posturing of collective security. Across the globe, China watched carefully. As one of the largest importers of Gulf oil, China had more than just a passing interest in the Strait of Hormuz, yet its position was complex. While China opposed any act that could destabilize the flow of energy, it also maintained strategic relations with Iran, viewing it as a counterweight to Western dominance. Beijing called for restraint and diplomacy, but it also increased its naval presence in the Indian Ocean, signaling that its interests would be defended if necessary. The crisis revealed the duality in China's global role, a rising power caught between being a neutral mediator and an assertive player in a multipolar world. Russia, too, seized the opportunity to expand its influence. It supported Iran's claim of defensive action against perceived threats, casting the closure as a response to Western provocation. Moscow offered to mediate while also floating the idea of joint naval patrols in the region. In doing so, it positioned itself as both an ally to Iran and a challenger to US authority in global affairs. For countries caught between spheres of influence, such as Turkey, India, and Pakistan, the situation was equally complex. These nations, with deep economic ties to both the West and the East, were forced to walk a diplomatic tightrope. The crisis also exposed the tensions within newer alliances. The BRICS coalition, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, struggled to produce a unified response. Their competing energy interests and divergent views on Iran rendered them ineffective as a bloc. Meanwhile, regional organizations like the Arab League issued statements condemning the closure but found themselves hamstrung by internal divisions and the conflicting interests of member states. What became evident was that the global security architecture is no longer as rigid as it once seemed. Cold War-era alliances, once defined by clear lines, have become blurry in a world driven by economics, energy, and regional calculations. The closure of the strait acted like a prism, refracting the true nature of global loyalties and dependencies. As nations responded, some with force, others with diplomacy, and many with hesitation. It became clear that this single event had shifted the tectonic plates of global geopolitics. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz sent ripples far beyond geopolitical war rooms and trading floors. It surged into the lives of ordinary people, transforming a strategic maneuver into a humanitarian concern of global proportions. Civilians, most with no role in the politics behind the act, suddenly found themselves at the mercy of decisions made thousands of miles away. From cities to rural villages, the consequences began to unfold in a language far more personal: scarcity, inflation, fear, and disruption. In countries heavily reliant on oil imports, the effects were immediate and harsh. The cost of transportation fuel spiked, leading to a domino effect on food prices, public services, and even electricity. In many parts of Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, where governments subsidize fuel to prevent economic instability, long queues began to form at petrol stations. Rationing became inevitable. Public transport systems reduced schedules, private vehicles sat idle. For millions living paycheck to paycheck, the sudden rise in everyday costs brought a sharp edge of desperation. In nations with fragile infrastructure or post-conflict economies, power generation was severely affected. Rolling blackouts became the norm. Hospitals, already struggling with limited resources, were forced to run on backup generators for extended periods. Cold chains for medicine and food preservation broke down. In parts of Yemen, Lebanon, and Pakistan, local authorities declared emergencies, warning that the combination of fuel shortage and high temperatures could lead to a public health crisis. Families in urban centers across the Middle East and Africa were hit especially hard. Food prices climbed steeply. Bread, rice, vegetables, and cooking oil became costlier with each passing day. Humanitarian agencies, already stretched thin by ongoing crises, reported a spike in demand for food assistance. Aid organizations dependent on diesel for transportation and relief distribution were themselves hampered by limited fuel access and inflated logistics costs. The emotional toll was no less severe. In the Gulf itself, the threat of escalation meant civilians began preparing for the worst. Grocery stores in Kuwait, Bahrain, and parts of Saudi Arabia saw runs on bottled water, canned goods, and essential supplies. Schools closed temporarily, air raid sirens were tested, families kept children indoors. In Iran, where economic sanctions had already burdened daily life, the government's action brought mixed reactions. Some viewed it as a bold assertion of sovereignty, while others feared retaliatory strikes, further sanctions, and deeper isolation. The refugee communities in the region, particularly Syrian, Afghan, and Palestinian populations, suffered in silence, with already minimal aid now further threatened. Humanitarian convoys moving through or near affected maritime routes faced delays and increased risk. Water purification systems that relied on consistent energy began failing. Sanitation in refugee camps became a growing concern, raising the risk of disease outbreaks. In Western countries, though buffered by stronger economies, citizens too felt the squeeze. Fuel prices soared, flights were cancelled or repriced. Heating costs surged. For working-class families in Europe and North America, monthly budgets buckled under the new pressure. Protests erupted in some cities. People questioned the fragile nature of global dependence on a single maritime choke point. Global aid organizations issued warnings. The United Nations highlighted the danger of turning an energy crisis into a humanitarian disaster. Calls were made to ensure protected shipping corridors for relief efforts. The World Food Programme began reallocating resources, anticipating a wave of new demand across vulnerable regions. For the world's civilians, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz became a vivid reminder that global politics is never far away. Decisions made in high councils are always felt at ground level. And in this instance, it was not just a strait that was shut, it was the door to normalcy for millions of ordinary people whose lives were cast suddenly into uncertainty. As the world reeled from the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the diplomatic machinery shifted into high gear. Global leaders, alarmed by the prospect of prolonged disruption and possible military escalation, scrambled to defuse the situation. Yet what followed was a maze of conflicting interests, delayed communications, veiled threats, and back-channel messages. The international community now found itself at a crossroads. Would diplomacy prevail in the face of mounting tension, or would the crisis spiral into a full-blown conflict? At the center of the standoff stood Iran, emboldened by its control over the strait and driven by a complex web of grievances, decades of sanctions, international isolation, and a perception of Western hostility. Iranian officials framed their actions as defensive, a response to what they described as foreign interference and economic warfare. While Iran expressed willingness to engage in talks, it did so with preconditions that many Western powers found unpalatable, chief among them the lifting of sanctions and guarantees of non-aggression. The United States, leading the charge to restore freedom of navigation, insisted that the closure was an act of aggression and a breach of international maritime law. Washington demanded an unconditional reopening of the strait before any negotiations could proceed. Behind closed doors, however, U.S. diplomats also recognized the need for dialogue. With military escalation carrying too many risks, the State Department quietly engaged regional allies and European partners to explore possible off-ramps. European powers, particularly France and Germany, sought to act as intermediaries. Having long advocated for a balanced approach toward Iran, they proposed a framework that included phased de-escalation, third-party monitoring of maritime activity, and partial sanction relief in exchange for reopening the strait. Yet this proposal was met with resistance on all sides. Iran viewed it as insufficient and lacking in guarantees, while hardliners in Washington and some Gulf capitals saw it as appeasement. The United Nations called for an emergency Security Council session. Yet the proceedings were predictably gridlocked. Veto-wielding powers, particularly Russia and China, refused to back any resolution condemning Iran outright. They emphasized the importance of respecting Iranian sovereignty and called for restraint from all parties, effectively shielding Tehran from unified global pressure. The Security Council once again became a stage for ideological competition rather than problem-solving. Meanwhile, quiet diplomatic efforts began to take shape in unexpected quarters. Oman, long respected for its neutrality and history of mediating between Iran and the West, opened discreet channels with Iranian leaders. Similarly, Qatar initiated informal discussions, leveraging its balanced relationships across the geopolitical spectrum. These back-channel efforts avoided the spectacle of high diplomacy, but made room for real dialogue. Initial conversations focused on humanitarian corridors, shipping of essential goods, and a potential international maritime oversight mechanism. Yet, despite these efforts, progress remained painfully slow. Every gesture of diplomacy was shadowed by military movements, every concession weighed against domestic political costs. In Tehran, factions within the government disagreed. Some favored negotiation while others saw the blockade as a bargaining chip not to be wasted. In Washington, the upcoming political cycle made compromise difficult as candidates warned against showing weakness. Gulf states, while supportive of diplomacy, feared that any deal would come at the cost of regional security guarantees. Global markets, watching the diplomatic dance, remained volatile. Oil prices fluctuated with each rumor of breakthrough or breakdown. Humanitarian organizations urged urgency, warning that delays would cost lives. Still, negotiators pressed on through neutral capitals, encrypted calls, and carefully worded press releases. The world stood in the balance. The Strait of Hormuz, now symbolic of a greater global contest, had become more than a maritime route. It was now the stage for a test of diplomacy in an age of mistrust, a test that could either revive the fading art of negotiation or expose its limits entirely. In the unfolding drama surrounding the Strait of Hormuz, the world has witnessed the delicate threads of global stability stretched to their limits. What began as a strategic maneuver by Iran has cascaded into a multifaceted crisis: economic, military, humanitarian, and diplomatic. Energy flows have halted, markets have convulsed, alliances have been tested, and millions of civilians have felt the chilling consequences of high-stakes geopolitics. The international community now finds itself standing at a precipice, caught between the lure of confrontation and the necessity of dialogue. Yet within this chaos lies a vital revelation. Our global systems are profoundly interconnected and deeply fragile. A narrow waterway, long taken for granted, has become the flashpoint of a world order that depends too heavily on thin lines and old assumptions. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz has not only exposed vulnerabilities, it has forced a reckoning. The question that remains is whether the nations of the world will allow this crisis to spiral into conflict or rise to meet it with vision, restraint, and renewed commitment to peace. The outcome will not be decided solely by firepower or sanctions, but by wisdom, leadership, and the willingness to listen before reacting. In this decisive hour, history awaits its next chapter, and the pen is firmly in humanity's hands.